Today, we're digging into a landmark Canadian murder case. But this isn't really a story about guilt or innocence. It's about what happens when the whole process of justice just goes off the rails. It's about why a conviction was thrown out more than a decade after the fact.
So what does it actually take to overturn a murder conviction? Well, the answer to that question gets right to the heart of what we even mean by a fair trial.
Okay, here are the basics. Back in 1992, a man named Robert Baltovich was convicted of murder. He went to prison. But then a full 12 years later, the Court of Appeal came back and said, nope, that trial, it was fundamentally unfair. And the difference is just, wow. You go from a guilty verdict for second-degree murder in 1992 to that conviction being completely set aside in 2004. Instead, the court orders a brand new trial. So the big question is, what on earth went so wrong?
Well, the appeal court pointed the finger squarely at one person, the original trial judge. They found that his actions didn't just tilt the scales of justice, they basically pushed them right over.
I mean, this one sentence from the appeal court says it all. It's the smoking gun. Think about how devastating that is. The judge didn't just make a few mistakes. The court found he actively pushed the prosecution's case forward while at the same time ignoring and even insulting the defense's case.
To really get that, you have to know what a charge to the jury is. It's basically the judge's final speech to the jury. It's supposed to be their neutral rule book, right? It explains the law and tells them how to look at the evidence.
But in this case, the judge's rule book was anything but neutral. The appeals court found it was so unbalanced that it basically became another closing argument for the prosecution. It was actively steering the jury towards a guilty verdict.
And this bias was a huge deal, especially when it came to the eyewitness testimony. You see, the Crown's entire case was built on just a couple of key witnesses, and this is where the problems really started to pile up.
So let's look at witness number 1, Miriam Perez. She said she saw Baltovich with the victim on the very day she disappeared. Her testimony was the absolute linchpin of the Crown's case. If the jury believed her, it was pretty much game over.
But her memory, well, it was anything but solid. At first, she told police she had a very limited memory. Then she sees a newspaper photo of Baltovich. Then she undergoes hypnosis, and suddenly her memory noticeably improved. And to top it all off, before a photo lineup, a police officer tells her, Rob's photo is in the group. This is like a textbook example of how a memory can get contaminated.
Now let's talk about the second key witness, David Dibben. He was crucial because he claimed he saw Baltovich driving the victim's car days after she disappeared. If that's true, it points directly to a consciousness of guilt. It's another devastating piece of evidence.
But sound familiar? His story kept changing. Look at this. The driver's hair color changes. The description of his facial hair changes. Even the color of the t-shirt he's wearing changes, not once, but twice. These aren't little details. These are huge red flags about how reliable that memory actually was.
And this brings us right back to the judge. See, the law says he was required to warn the jury about these specific problems. The hypnosis, the changing descriptions. But he didn't. He just gave a generic boilerplate warning that you could give in any case. He completely failed to connect the dots for the jury on how fragile this evidence really was.
So the judge totally mishandled the Crown's evidence. But what about the other side of the coin? What about the defense's story? Well, the court found he failed there too, and it was a big one. It had to do with Baltovich's alibi.
So what's an alibi? It's pretty simple, right? It's just a defense that says, hey, I couldn't have done it because I was somewhere else. In this case, Baltovich claimed he was at home with his family during the crucial time window.
And the judge made two huge errors when explaining this to the jury. First, he basically told them that if they didn't believe the alibi, they could use that disbelief as proof that he was guilty. That's a major legal mistake. And second, he wrongly limited what evidence they could even look at when considering the alibi.
This wasn't some minor technical issue. The court said this error went to the heart of the defense. The judge essentially took the defendant's biggest shield, his alibi, and told the jury they could use it as a sword against him. Okay, so the trial was a mess, right? The judge's instructions were biased, the eyewitness testimony was super shaky, the alibi was completely mishandled, so that leads to a pretty logical question.
You're probably wondering, if the trial was this bad, why didn't the court just acquit him? Why not just say, he's innocent, let him go? Why order a whole do-over with a new trial?
And the reason comes down to this.
The legal bar for an appeal court to step in and grant an acquittal is incredibly high, like almost impossibly high. Any new evidence can't just create some doubt. It has to be, in the court's words, clearly decisive of innocence. It has to basically prove it.
The defense team brought forward a ton of new evidence. They had stuff that backed up Baltovich's story, things that undermined the Crown's witnesses, and even a potential, though speculative, link to the serial killer Paul Bernardo. But while all of that weakened the Crown's case, none of it was strong enough to hit that clearly decisive mark.
So in the end, the court landed here. They said, look, the first trial was unfair, no question. But there was still just enough evidence that a new jury, one that was properly instructed by a neutral judge, could still reasonably convict him. They couldn't rule it out, so they couldn't just acquit him.
And that gets to the core of it. What is the one thing the justice system is supposed to guarantee? It's not a particular outcome. It's one fair trial. Robert Baltovich never got one. And so the remedy wasn't to declare him innocent. It was to finally give him the fair process he'd been denied all along.
And that leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. This whole case forces us to ask, let's say an unfair trial somehow ends up convicting the right person. Is that still a form of justice? Or, if the process itself is broken, is it a complete and total failure of everything the system is supposed to stand for?